So let's begin with a word of prayer tonight. Oh God, you gather us from all over the place, and we're so grateful for this time together, and especially grateful for Emily, the work that she does through Kansas Interfaith Action and her colleagues there. For people all across the ELCA and in other communities of faith who do the work of advocacy and seeking justice. Open our hearts and our ears and our eyes tonight and in the days to come, O God, and be with us as we learn together. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, thank you. Emily is with us tonight. Emily Wilkinson. She is a lifelong Catholic Kansan who's dedicated to equitable care for God's creation. Since October 2022, she has been a small cities organizer with Kansas Interfaith Action, or KIFA, we call it. Emily works with faith communities in small rural adjacent cities across the state and is KIFA's lead staff contact for climate justice issues. She will be presenting tonight a presentation called Climate Advocacy 101 that equips us with the tools and strategies to effectively engage with government leaders and advocate for more robust climate policies. So we will learn from her how to better use our voices and values to drive meaningful change on our planet. And just a word of thanks to Emily for the great work she does and a great partner for all of us. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Emily.
Thank you so much, Noni. That almost made me a little emotional. So I'm glad we don't have a huge group to see that. But as you pull up my slideshow, I can go ahead and get started with this. So we're going to start this presentation with a primer on what faith-based advocacy is, and then from there learn the ins and outs of advocating for climate justice across all levels of governing bodies, and then return back to our principles of faith to round out the evening. So we can go to the next slide. Kansas Interfaith Action is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, statewide, multi-faith issue advocacy organization that puts faith into action by educating, engaging, and advocating on behalf of people of faith and the public regarding critical social, economic, and climate justice issues. KIFA supporters are shaped by the values of our diverse faiths, which connect us to the age-old concern for justice, peace, and human dignity. Rooted in faith, we join hands across difference to work to bring a moral voice to Kansas public policy. Our work centers around 4 intersectional circles: anti-violence, economic justice, environmental justice, and fighting identity-based discrimination. We're inspired by what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of in his speech, The Three Evils of Society, in 1967, which he determined were racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. We've added climate justice to this list of priorities as Dr. King was at that point unaware of the trauma that we would cause the earth over the next 50 or more years. So we can go to the next slide. What is faith-based advocacy? Faith-based advocacy is the way in which people of various religious backgrounds use the values and vision of their faith to affect change in public policy at all levels of government. No matter the religious identity, people of faith are called to work for justice, mercy, and equity. Dr. King is often quoted thusly: "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority." End quote. Faith communities have an important role in crafting and changing public policy. Some of the issues here are that faith communities can frame issues in a moral language, not merely economic or political or data-driven, which is what most people see in the State House, most expect in the State House. Concern for the most vulnerable is another hallmark of religious communities, building the beloved community, as Dr. King once called it. Faith communities are able to communicate effectively because they resonate with our deepest values. Our books mean what they say, and we advocate on those books' behalf. We can heal the damage of the past as faith communities. we can speak together for the common good, moving beyond the witness or focus of individuals to build healthy communities in the broadest sense within the public sphere. So I want to share 3 scripture readings from 3 of the world's Abrahamic religious traditions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. On the left here, from the book of Isaiah, we can go through these pretty fast since everyone can read them themselves. This is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry, to take the wretched poor into your home, when you see the naked to clothe them and not ignore your own kin. And then in the Hadiths, Allah's messenger said, help your brother, whether he is, whether he is an oppressor or he is an oppressed one. And people asked, oh, Allah's messenger, is it all right to help? It is all right to help him if he is oppressed, but how should we help him if he is an oppressor? And the prophet said, by preventing him from oppressing others. And finally, in the New Testament, James writes, imagine one who is naked and never has enough food to eat. What if one of you said, go in peace, stay warm, have a nice meal? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it does not result in faithful activity. Someone might claim, you have faith and I have action, but how can I see your faith apart from your actions? Instead, I'll show you my faith by putting it into practice in a faithful action. As we read the sacred... Sorry.
That was this week's reading.
Oh.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Serendipitous. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
As we read these sacred texts side by side, we're faced with this moral imperative to advocate for our fellow human beings. The divine calls for us to address hunger, poverty, oppression, and protect our earth, which means advocating for fair and just policies in the public sphere. The way Kifa addresses these issues is by coming together in what Dr. King called the beloved community, a multi-faith, multi-issue coalition from all over the state of Kansas. We recognize that each of us as individuals and our faith traditions by themselves cannot answer all of the relevant questions of today or address all of our needs politically. But it is by coming together in mutual respect, cooperation, and love that we model the kind of peaceful, compassionate, cooperative world we want to build and to begin to effect meaningful change. That, broadly, is what I would call faith-based advocacy. So who has the power to change things? I think something that's incredibly important and maybe even overlooked because it seems so simple is that when we are advocating for certain causes, like I don't think it's fair, for example, that in my city, you can only have 1 solar panel on your roof. Again, that seems unfair. And so, but we have to say who made that decision, you know, what level of government was that decision made so that we can affect that change. Because I've also worked in different levels of government too. Just as an aside, I was an intern for Representative Sharice Davids, who's within the federal government. And I frequently received calls from constituents with different complaints, different points of policy that they wanted to discuss. And I can't tell you how many times people had issues that would be better resolved with their city council member or with their state representative or with their local zoning board. And so it's important, I think, in order to be effective, to know exactly who has the power to make the decisions on the issues that we care about the most. So I've listed 4 here. I'm sure there are many more stakeholders in terms of who makes the decisions, broadly speaking. I mean, there's plenty of corporations who work in textiles, for example, who aren't managing the waste appropriately. I think that goes without saying for a number of different industries too. But for now, we're going to tackle the public realm, governments. So local, state, and federal policies all play crucial roles in addressing climate change. Local governments can implement targeted, community-specific initiatives. State governments can set ambitious standards and create frameworks for broader action. And the federal government can enact sweeping policies with nationwide and even global implications. The effectiveness of climate action often depends on the coordination and alignment of policies across these different levels of government. I also want to draw your attention to a 4th layer at the bottom, which will vary greatly between states. State agencies, boards, and commissions also play a critical role in addressing climate change by developing and implementing policies, regulations, and programs that promote environmental sustainability and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's pretty broad, so I will name an example from the gold standard of regulatory bodies in California. One real world example of a state agency impacting climate change is the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, which has significantly impacted climate change policies both within California and beyond. CARB is a state agency that sets and enforces air quality standards, and it's been at the forefront of implementing innovative climate policies and also innovating changes within the ways that cars are manufactured. If cars can't be sold in California, that's a problem for car manufacturers across the country and overseas. So California is able to set the tone for emissions regulations in that way through an agency and not through necessarily local or state legislatures themselves. So later in this presentation, I will also share a brief case study of an example of grassroots advocacy with a state commission in Kansas. But for now, let's break down the first 3 points. We can go to the next slide for that. How does your county, city, zoning board, et cetera, affect the climate? The first point would be urban planning and zoning. Local governments can help shape cities in ways that reduce carbon emissions. For example, cities can promote and prioritize high density development, which encourages walking, cycling, use of public transportation rather than relying on cars. In cities that are very old and very car centric, that can be a really difficult task, but it can include things like making streets more walkable, building cycling lanes, et cetera. The second point, building codes. Cities and towns can adopt building codes that require new structures to be energy efficient. For example, local policies may mandate the use of renewable energy sources, energy efficient windows and insulation in buildings. These measures can significantly reduce energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Waste management, not a particularly glamorous element of climate, but very important nonetheless. Local governments manage waste collection and disposal. Implementing robust recycling and composting programs at a local level can reduce the amount of waste that ends up in landfills where it decomposes and releases methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Some cities have also adopted policies to ban or reduce single-use plastics, further reducing waste and associated emissions. And then green space and trees, another pretty regular example that you would just find outside on your day-to-day. Local governments protect and expand green spaces such as parks and urban forests, which act as carbon sinks by absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. And additionally, planting native trees along streets and public spaces can reduce the urban heat island effect, lowering the need for air conditioning and thereby reducing energy use. So let's go to the next slide and look at state policies. How does your state legislature impact climate change? Some of these examples are coming from firsthand experience of advocating for climate in Kansas, which is an uphill battle, as you can imagine. So the first one that I've encountered over the past few years is called preemption. This is something that I didn't really know about before I got into this role. But preemption in state politics refers to a situation where a higher level of government, like the state government, limits or eliminates the power of lower levels of governments, like cities or counties, to regulate certain issues. So for example, in my city, in Lawrence, the city commission a few years ago decided to enact a ban on single-use plastics. And quickly, the Kansas state legislature went to great pains to preempt this action. And in fact, they've been fighting this local ban on single-use plastics for 3 years now, 3 different legislative sessions. This is brought up again to try to prevent this from happening in other cities. Preemption is a serious obstacle that can prevent local governments from taking action on climate change. Another thing that state policy can affect are renewable energy mandates. States can pass laws requiring utilities to generate a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources like wind, solar, and hydroelectric power. I'm going to use California as an example again, because they're a gold standard oftentimes when it comes to policies like this. But for example, California's Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, requires that 60% of the state's electricity comes from renewable sources by 2030. That drives investment in clean energy and reduces the reliance on fossil fuels. Another is a state energy plan, or in Kansas, a lack thereof. California is able to create and enforce renewable energy mandates because their state has envisioned a plan for energy use over the next few decades. My own state, Kansas, is one of few at this point states that still does not have an energy plan, which makes goal setting for the future difficult to envision and impossible to manage if we don't know what expectations are. While Kansans have taken steps to leverage federal support, like the IRA and its natural resources like wind for renewable energy, and we have become a huge producer of wind energy in Kansas, our climate action at the state legislative level has been significantly less aggressive compared to other states. Another example, states can set vehicle emission standards that are stricter than federal requirements. Like California, their zero emission vehicle program mandates that a certain percentage of cars sold in the state be electric or hybrid vehicles. This policy has not only reduced emissions, but it's also driven innovation within the automotive industry so that more cars are able to be hybrid cars, or different auto industries that didn't have a hybrid option before now do. Finally, energy efficiency programs. States can implement energy efficiency programs that provide incentives for businesses and homeowners to reduce their energy consumption. These programs might include rebates for energy efficient appliances, grants for weatherizing homes, or requirements for utility companies to reduce their customers' energy use through efficiency improvements. Next slide. So how does the federal government impact climate change? This one can be huge. The federal government has the broadest scope and can implement nationwide policies that have a significant impact on climate change, both domestically and globally. So the regulation of greenhouse gases is the biggest one. The federal government, through agencies like the EPA, can regulate greenhouse gas emissions from major sources like power plants, factories, and vehicles. The Clean Air Act, for example, has been used to set emission standards for cars and industrial facilities and significantly reduces pollutants that contribute to climate change. Subsidies and tax incentives. The federal government can offer subsidies and tax incentives for renewable energy projects, electric vehicles, and energy efficient technologies. And these financial incentives can make clean energy alternatives more competitive with fossil fuels, which accelerates the transition into a low carbon economy. International agreements is a way that the federal government can actually impact the whole world. The federal government can play a crucial role in negotiating and ratifying international climate agreements like the Paris Agreement. By committing to global climate targets and implementing domestic policies to meet these targets, the federal government can influence international climate action and demonstrate leadership on a global stage. Infrastructure development. Federal investment in infrastructure can significantly impact climate change. Funding for public transportation projects can reduce reliance on personal vehicles, for example. Similarly, federal support for research and development in clean energy technologies can lead to breakthroughs that reduce the cost and increase the adoption of renewable energy. And agriculture and land use is another major one, especially in my own state. The federal government can influence climate-related policies in agriculture through the Farm Bill and through other legislation. This might include incentives for farmers to adopt sustainable practices, such as no-till farming, cover cropping, and methane capture and livestock emissions, all of which can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I have not had the most positive interactions with our federal leaders who are sort of right-leaning on climate. But one thing that they do have a very strong support for is research and development on agricultural solutions for climate. There's a lot of money in that stage right now. It seems like the agricultural industry will be transitioning to cleaner solutions very quickly. It's really incredible what's been able to be done just through investment into those things alone. So we can go on to the next slide. Now we're on to grassroots lobbying. What do we do with all of that information? And, now that we know who the power players are and what they're capable of being able to do, how can we influence them? How can we affect them? So grassroots lobbying is a form of advocacy that seeks to influence public policy by encouraging the general public to contact legislators and government officials to express their opinions on specific issues. Unlike traditional lobbying, which typically involves direct interactions between a paid professional lobbyist and lawmakers, grassroots lobbying mobilizes ordinary citizens to participate in the political process, often through campaigns, petitions, letters, phone calls, or public demonstrations. The goal is to create widespread public pressure that persuades policymakers to act in accordance with the interests and concerns of the grassroots supporters. What makes grassroots advocacy effective is not a single conversation had in your state legislator's office. What makes grassroots advocacy effective is building sustained engagement with those stakeholders who wield power to change your chosen climate issue. So right here, we can discuss some of those action items. These are just very basic, like, action items, first steps for different levels that we've mentioned. So within local advocacy, you have a lot of options. There are so many public meetings that you are able to attend, city commission meetings. In my own city, in Douglas County, during county commission meetings, but also during city council meetings. We've recently had a pretty concerted effort from some anti-solar residents who are really opposed to industrial scale solar in Douglas County. And those people show up to public meetings and they all dress in the same colors. They use the same talking points. They're very well organized. And so to the city commission, to the county commission, that looks like what the public wants. They see all of these people wearing the same clothes, saying the same things, and, you know, they could understandably think our constituents don't want solar. We better not make any moves in that direction. That's why it's so important to be visible on your chosen issue within local government. Even just your presence in local meetings can really influence the perception of your local lawmakers. Something that's nice about your city and county commission is also how accessible those leaders are. The districts for each level of government get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until those leaders are literally within your own neighborhood. I have worked at different levels of government and also just as an intern within advocacy itself. And I was an intern with an organization for youth civic engagement called Loud Light many years ago. I feel terribly old even bringing it up because it makes me realize how long ago college actually was. But when I was an intern, they said, okay, book a meeting with a legislator. And I thought that was, you know, unreasonable. I couldn't imagine why a legislator would even want to talk to me. I was 19 years old. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know what I would talk about with them. So I figured it would be easiest to reach out to my county commissioner. And it was incredibly easy. I just sent her an email. I said, you know, I have some questions about the topic of mental health in the county and how accessible it is for the poorest people. What does accessibility look like? How easy is it to access? And she was more than happy to grab coffee with me and to have that conversation with an ignorant 19-year-old that really didn't know up from down on that issue. I'm sure not all interactions with local officials will be that positive, but I really encourage you to take the first step and just build that relationship. Your local officials are really willing to hear you out most of the time if you approach them with kindness and respect and patience for their time. Additionally, something that I'll also mention as we start discussing like agencies, boards, things like that. I'll be honest, I mean, I've been working with like climate justice with Kifa for almost 2 years now, and I still get so confused by the legalese that's written on zoning boards discussing, you know, what size solar panels have to be, how many inches they can be from the side of your property, things like that. It gets really, really detailed, really, really fast. But I also know that on my county's website, on Douglas County's website, there are public email addresses for those boards. And if I have questions, there's no harm in asking them, especially if the issue is something that I think is being handled locally, like if an issue with not being able to access solar, if I think it's happening locally, and I ask my zoning board and they say this is actually the result of statewide legislation, then I can advocate more effectively because I have more background information on that issue. So I'd say local advocacy is very approachable, pretty easy. But if we're moving into statewide advocacy, we have elections coming up. I know that everyone knows this. I'm not surprising you with this information, but I think something that's been really useful for advocates in the past is whether they have a new representative or if their representative has just won their election. Something that I like to do if I'm trying to build a sustaining relationship with my own representative is that I will send them an email and congratulate them, even if I don't feel particularly happy about their win. I congratulate them and say, you know, I'm really looking forward to working together with you on climate issues, which is what I'm so passionate about. Let them know that you'll be in touch. It really builds a sense of accountability with you, and then they will be expecting your phone call. They will be expecting another email from you, hoping to set something up. So I'd say just open the door a little bit is sort of the lesson from each of these. But with federal advocacy too, you can call or write your representative or senator's district office. Like I mentioned, I was an intern with Representative Sharice David's local district office, and we do respond and write down notes for every single call that is put in from constituents. Granted that they are constituents. If you call in from Wisconsin, I'm not going to take those notes. But if you are a constituent and you think that the federal government is far away, not listening to you, that may be the case practically, but we are taking down notes for every conversation. And we know when you've called multiple times. People are keeping track of that, and those comments are read. They are collected together and they are read to the representative, even if it feels like a pretty distant process. Another thing that I remember from my work in the district office is that sometimes people will call and they say, I would like to talk to the legislator. That's very unlikely to happen, especially with no prior scheduling or anything. But even when the representative is back from DC and into his or her district, they are constantly on the move for these different events, these different stakeholders that they're meeting. And it's just unlikely that unless you have not scheduled this like a year in advance, that you'll just be able to meet with your representative face to face. But district staff office is great. They are such a wealth of knowledge. And if you really want to communicate to your representatives at the federal government, the best way that you can do this is to bring a group of roughly 3 to 5 people, all communicating on one chosen issue and telling staff that you'd like to book a meeting with them at their district office. And you want to talk about this issue and why it's so important to constituents in that district. And we can talk a little bit more about what that conversation would entail. But even if the federal government feels like it's far away, they're in Washington, D.C., they aren't really thinking about just the small minutia of every individual constituent, you still have power in that context. You still have the ability to advocate for yourself. So now I'm going to talk about the organizing conversation in itself that you can have with your legislator. I sent the PDF of the 5-finger model to Noni, which you can send out with this recording. But essentially the 5-finger model is a step-by-step guide for how to have these conversations and how to effectively communicate with your legislator. This is very basic, again, climate 101 stuff. And I know that there are very effective communicators out there who probably don't need this, but just as a refresher, just as a 101, we can go through each of the points. All of it stems from your personal story. What brings you into their office? The first thing that I suggest with these interactions, these calls, is to just get into who you are and why you are there. Introduce yourself, where you live, how long you have lived there as a constituent. Something that I've encountered as we take groups of people as KIFA, when we take faith leaders to the state capitol, legislators will welcome them into our office and then they will immediately ask, are these people my constituents? And I don't want to say that they don't care if they aren't, but they definitely take it with less consideration if it's not coming from their own constituents. So make sure that you are talking to the right person, the person that represents you, and then, you know, talk about your city, why you live there, why you love it so much, etc. Just really introduce yourself and your story. And so the second point of this is what the issue is. The more specific you can be about this, the better. If you are in the midst of the legislative session, for example, it's the most helpful, most effective thing you can do is have the bill number right there with you and say, I'm here to talk to you about this House bill, specifically about preemption. The more specific you can be, the easier it will be to make the ask in step 5. So when you've addressed the issue and why you're there to talk about it, you can go straight into that personal story. What really draws you to this issue and what has brought you into either their office, into a phone call with them to talk to them about it. I think for many people, there is maybe a desire to bring with you a lot of data, a lot of different examples across the state of why this issue is important to you. But I really recommend just going back to that personal story. I mentioned earlier when we were defining grassroots lobbying that what draws it apart from traditional lobbying is that lobbyists have all of that knowledge. They have the facts and figures and they share them with the legislators. But you are a constituent, and that really changes the dynamic that you can have in those conversations. They can listen to you as a person and not as a lobbyist. At the end of the day, you are representing yourself and your faith community, and you don't have to, carry the knowledge of the entire issue on your back. They're not expecting that either. So it's not a book report. Just be yourself and talk about why you are so drawn to that issue, why it is important. And then the fourth finger is why they should care. Why does this issue affect your district specifically? It's a statewide issue. For example, preemption highly affects my district because I personally like the ban on single-use plastics. The grocery stores have not all packed up and left, like all of the fear-mongering about single-use plastic bans. None of that has really come to fruition. And I'm happy to share with them that the single-use plastic ban has actually improved Lawrence. It's created a lot less litter. I don't see as much plastic bags just floating down the street anymore. And that's just because there's less of them out there, less of them in circulation. And then the fifth point is to make the ask and to make it as clear as possible. Again, the more detailed you can be about your chosen issue, the better. You can see the very small text under the 5-finger. Will you support House Bill such and such or Senate Bill such and such? Try to phrase this in a yes or no ask so that they can't exactly give you a non-answer. You'd be impressed at how many politicians are still able to give you a non-answer. They're very talented at that. But try to keep it as concrete, yes or no as possible. Will you support this bill? Will you oppose this bill? And then you may get the answer you're looking for, or you may get an answer that you're really not looking for. But regardless, I would say that this is the very basic 5-step process for having this kind of conversation with your legislator. We don't have 6 fingers on our hands, but if I could give you a example of maybe something to do after your conversation, I really suggest writing a thank you letter. Legislators do take a lot of time on the floor at the State House. They spend a lot of time moving between different meetings. And sometimes also something I forgot to mention is that frequently your meetings will be interrupted with something. They may call down a vote immediately in the middle of your conversation and you've only made it 3 sentences in and they say, I'm so sorry, but I have to go. Make sure that you can follow up with them via email or send them a voicemail and say, I really had a good time talking with you. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. When can we make that happen? I really suggest also in that follow-up conversation, having some other kind of ask, whether it's, will you follow up with me when the vote for this is over? Or I'm looking forward to chatting with you after the vote is passed. I'll be seeing what choice you decide to make at that point. We can go on to the next slide. So I wanted to use an example of how you can use the 5-finger model in a pinch. Not everyone has time to trek over to the state capitol. For me, it's only 30 minutes away, but for people in other parts of Kansas, it's more of a 5-hour drive. So I can't expect everyone to advocate at a statewide level that way when our state is as spread out as it is. So sometimes a voicemail or a phone call to your legislator's assistant can be effective in a pinch. It's not my favorite. I always want to do a face-to-face conversation if I can. But the 5-finger model can be a 5-sentence rubric for a voicemail. And I am going to give you an example right now. This is my phone. I'm leaving a voicemail for Senator Ledge E. Slater. I would say something like, hi, my name's Emily Wilkinson, and I'm a constituent of yours living in West Lawrence. I'm calling about HB 2446, which would prohibit cities and counties from regulating plastic bags and containers. This issue is important to me because I believe that cities should be able to enact sensible environmental policies without interference from the state. This bill could have seriously destructive consequences to our state if in the future municipalities are unable to respond to climate change because their hands are tied by the state legislature. And that's why I'm counting on you to vote no on HB 2446. Thank you very much for your time and consideration. Goodbye. That's a 5-sentence way to have the conversation using just that guide. Again, it's not ideal to just do 5 sentences, but it's a way that you might be able to use that resource. And then finally, emails are efficient. You can get them out very quickly, but I'm going to be honest, they get lost all the time. I've talked to people who are former legislators' assistants, and emails are so easy to click open and then click close and not read all of them. Try instead, if you are more drawn to writing things, if you feel that you are able to best communicate, I highly suggest a handwritten letter or a postcard. Those actually get picked up and looked at. I can say from experience. Postcard writing campaigns are also pretty simple to organize within different churches and social ministry groups, very easy to deliver. So I would recommend thinking outside the box if you're thinking about sending an email. I mean, obviously you want to send an email to set up those conversations, but probably not have the conversation themselves. So we can move on. We are going to skip practice because it's already 7:40. And then I wanted to get into that case study that I mentioned earlier about climate advocacy within a state agency, commission, or board. Remember again that every state is totally different and every state agency responds to public input differently. But with that in mind, this is a story about Kifa's work last year driving public comments on a proposed utility rate hike. Many state agencies like utility boards or special task forces operate mainly without public input, but sometimes on occasions, on issues that are affecting the entire state, they will occasionally open themselves up for public comment. The background information is a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it quickly enough. Let's set the stage. Evergy is an investor-owned utility which serves 1.6 million customers in Kansas and Missouri, and it was formed from a merger of Westar and Kansas City Power and Light in 2018. As a condition of that merger, the Kansas Corporation Commission, or the KCC, essentially barred Evergy from increasing its rates for 5 years. In April 2023, for the first time after that 5-year moratorium, Evergy filed a request with the KCC, the Kansas Corporation Commission, to increase its rates for Kansas customers by $218 million a year. For the average customer in the Kansas metro area, or this dark blue section in the center, the requested rate would mean about $3.47 each month of an increase. But for the rest of the company's Kansas territory here in green, which covers most of the eastern half of the state, monthly bills would rise by about $14.24. Evergy said fees for small businesses and industrial centers would go up 19% on average, and fees for schools and churches would increase by 25%.
Whoa.
On the next slide, please. So Evergy's filing said that most of the requested increase would be to pay for upgrades to the system, including replacing power lines and adding technology that can more quickly isolate the cause of a power outage. Another chunk they claimed would help them recoup costs from its aging coal plants in order to retire them. Now, Evergy's sudden interest in sustainable infrastructure from their filing interested us for a couple of reasons. First, we knew from experience through state advocacy that Evergy opposes many legislative efforts to allow its customers more access to solar power. And second, Evergy's claim that they need this rate hike to close their aging coal plants came on the heels of an announcement to delay the closure of a Lawrence coal plant in Kansas by 3 years. Evergy had planned to close its Lawrence coal plant by the end of 2023 and add 700 megawatts of solar power by the end of 2024. But instead, in 2023, they walked back to those promises significantly. Evergy's new plan at that time would be to not add any solar power until 2026 and to keep the Lawrence coal plant open until 2028. Next slide, please. Needless to say, the request to raise rates and double down on coal was unpopular. At public hearings across Kansas, Evergy was met with anger from customers. Additionally, KCC staff conducted a detailed financial audit and determined that Evergy's proposed $218 million rate hikes were unjustified. They recommended that Evergy actually lower rates in the Kansas metro area and only slightly increase rates for the rest of the state. Remember, Evergy wanted a 9.77% rate increase for roughly $205 million in new revenue. And now this audit from the KCC said that only a 1.66% increase, or roughly $35 million, was all that could be justified. Bad news for Evergy at that point. Next slide, please. Now, the KCC report didn't necessarily spell the end for Evergy's proposed rate hike. The KCC still had a few more weeks to make their decision, but at this point, it was clear that public opinion was not on Evergy's side here. So with a month or so left before the public comment deadline, Kifa and our partners at other nonprofits and churches sprung into action. We knew that Evergy's rate hike was unpopular, and we believe that consumers should have the final say, not just for the sake of their energy bills, but for the good of Kansas's environment too. Kifa and our partners at the Climate and Energy Project and the Sierra Club Kansas chapter organized a rally outside City Hall in Lawrence with two objectives. First, to pressure Evergy to reaffirm their promise to close the Lawrence coal plant and invest in cleaner, cheaper alternatives. And second, to connect with attendees at the rally to equip them with all the tools and information they needed to leave a public comment with the KCC. Public comments could be submitted to the KCC through a few different avenues. There was an online form, people could call them, or mail a letter to their office. Since the online form was the most straightforward route, we created a QR code to use during the rally that we could carry on a clipboard. Folks could scan it on their phone, leave a public comment, and within a few minutes, they had done their part for grassroots advocacy. And this was a uniquely effective opportunity because as people protested and saw each other, they were able to be more and more fired up in that moment and more willing to make some kind of statement. They were able to make a difference easily too by transferring that frustration and that indignation into action right then and there. They didn't have to wait and go home to do it. They could just do it on the fly, on their phones during the protest itself, which was a huge motivator for people. And I think prompted some very well thought out emotional public comments. So after the public comment deadline passed, the KCC released those comments under a downloadable PDF. We knew that public opinion was not on Evergy's side here, but to see it all collected into one document and published was just tremendous. That document was nearly 4,000 pages long, and the vast majority opposed the proposed rate hike. The commissioners themselves seemed shocked by the enormous backlash, with one commissioner remarking, "In all my years working inside and outside the KCC, I don't recall the public commenting so forcefully and in unison on this issue." Ultimately, Evergy's rate case was resolved at a settlement conference with unanimous agreement from stakeholders. Evergy's original request was not approved. Their request for a $218 million increase was cut back to a $74 million increase, which meant that Kansas Central customers would see roughly a $4.64 increase to their electric bill, which is $10 less than what Evergy had requested. On top of that, Evergy Metro customers in the Kansas City area would actually see a $42.9 million rate decrease instead of the $3.37 a month rate increase that Evergy had originally asked for, which translates to roughly $6.07 a month being decreased on their energy bills. So not only was the proposed rate hike declined, it actually tangibly changed things for electricity consumers in the Kansas City area. The agreed upon $74 million net increase is the plan for that funds is to cover investment in a new wind farm, a residential battery storage pilot program, while keeping the monthly customer charge steady for all residential customers in both territories. Unfortunately, though, Lawrence's coal plant will still be in operation until 2028, at least as far as I know at this point. In the end, the response to Evergy's dirty rate hike reaffirmed the power of public comment and grassroots advocacy in Kansas. While climate advocates struggle to tread water amidst a right-wing supermajority in our Kansas state legislature, we've seen time and time again that Kansans themselves are actually quite moderate on climate change and are willing to express dissent with their leaders when time calls for it. Our organization saw a huge opportunity when public comments opened, so I hope this story might inspire some of you to consider how you and your congregation could mobilize under similar circumstances. Would you be ready for public comment to open on something as massive as this? What would it take to initiate a letter writing campaign within your congregation with limited notice, or a petition maybe? How would your church respond when this glowing opportunity for action arises? Fighting Evergy's rate hike was a huge win for climate advocates in Kansas, and I don't want to lose sight of that. But if I'm honest, that feeling of victory was short-lived. I've met with faith-based climate advocates in plenty of red and blue states, and when we trade stories like this, it feels like we're in two completely different worlds sometimes. I've used California as an example of a state with really innovative climate policies, and great work is being done across the spectrum on climate justice issues in states like Washington, Oregon, Maryland, and much more. In comparison, Kansas seems to have moved as still as a statue on climate, and it can be so demoralizing. The legislature has proven for years to be a difficult terrain for enacting responsible climate policy, and for many advocates, a feeling of anxiety accompanies feelings of hopelessness that things will just never change. I think the most essential element of faithful climate advocacy is faith, being able to fall back on our trust in a higher power. Religious faith is a powerful source of resilience in facing the emotional anxiety about climate change. Faith communities provide strong support networks, and praying together for our common home can reduce feelings of isolation and provide a sense of belonging and shared purpose. One of my biggest reasons for fighting for the environment is because deep in nature, I feel God's presence the closest. I want to protect and nurture that opportunity for creation with the Lord for future generations, because without it, without the prairies, without clean rivers, without clean skies, without biodiversity and all of the life that He made for us, I would be without Him. So now I want to invite us to turn our attention to our faith. When I feel climate advocacy, when I feel like my own meager presence and my own meager conversations can't change anything, I find it comforting to pray on or meditate on persistence, resilience, and intergenerational responsibility. Think of it as planting the seeds for the next generation. I want to share a few passages from different scriptures that might illuminate that presence. The first is the story of Honi and the circle drawer and the carob tree from the Talmud. This tale begins with Honi walking along the road when he sees an old man planting a carob tree. Curious, Honi asks the man how long it will take for the tree to bear fruit, and the man replies that it will take 70 years. Honi then asks, "Do you expect me to live long enough to eat its fruit?" And the man responds, "I found the world provided carob trees because my ancestors planted them for me, so I too am planting for my descendants." According to the story, Honi then falls asleep for 70 years, and when he wakes up, he sees a man gathering fruit from a fully grown carob tree. He asks the man if he was the one who planted it, but the man replies that it was his grandfather that planted that tree. The man planting the carob tree represents this idea of intergenerational responsibility. He plants the tree not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of future generations. His willingness to plant a tree whose fruits he will never enjoy reflects a deep faith in the future, the belief that his actions today will contribute to a better future, even if he does not personally witness this outcome. Faithful climate resilience involves thinking beyond our immediate needs and desires for change and considering the long-term impacts of our actions today. We must reflect on past and future actions, building on the knowledge and practices of previous generations while adapting them to new circumstances. When our children are older and begin to advocate for creation themselves, what do you want them to learn from your own experience, from your own successes, but also from your own failures? And I think this story with Honi really ties in very well with this section from the Bhagavad Gita on duty. It says, "You have a right to perform your prescribed duty, but you are not entitled to the fruits of action. Never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities, and never be attached to not doing your duty." Arjuna was therefore advised by the Lord to fight as a matter of duty without attachment to the result. Inaction is sinful. Like many Eastern traditions, detachment from earthly needs and desires is understood as a manifestation of inner peace. The Lord advises us to glorify Him and to carry out our duty, but not to grow so attached to the consequences of our actions that it blinds us from seeing and acknowledging all of his graces today. And on the right, this passage from the Catholic Catechism is related to the seventh commandment, which traditionally focuses on the principle of you shall not steal. However, the Catechism expands the understanding of this commandment to include broader ethical responsibilities, including concerning environment and creation. This passage here stresses that humans must consider how their actions not only impact their immediate surroundings, but also the quality of life of their neighbors and future generations. It reflects the Catholic principle of the common good, which seeks to ensure that the benefits of creation are shared fairly and sustainably. It says the seventh commandment enjoins respect for the integrity of creation. Use of the mineral, vegetable, and animal resources of the universe cannot be divorced from respect for moral imperatives. Man's dominion over inanimate and other living beings granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of its neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. This passage stresses that humans must consider how their actions affect not only their immediate surroundings, but also the consequences for future generations. That's it. That's all I have for this presentation. Does anyone have any questions at this point? I know that that was a lot.
Oh, but it was so comprehensive, and I think so useful. Even, people could use different parts. I just found that to be brilliant, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. That was
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that, Noni. I do wonder, are there organizations like yours, all across the states? Like,
Yeah, so
I
do
yeah, go ahead.
they all have different names, or they just insert the name of the state? I haven't heard of that.
So we are actually the state affiliate of a national organization called Interfaith Power and Light. I believe they have a Merrill Lynch
okay.
chapter. Interfaith Power and Light is an interfaith group that works on climate.
Right.
There are also interfaith coalitions in different states that may not exclusively focus on climate change, but also broader issues. When Kifa started many years ago, we had just started as an affiliate of Interfaith Power and Light, and our bread and butter was climate. And then eventually we expanded into these different issue areas as we were inspired by the work of Reverend Dr. King and trying to emulate his example in that way. So there are a number of interfaith organizations. I've been trying to look into others so that I can even just chat with them about some of their own advocacy approaches, because it really can be just really, really different in different states. I've been to different IPL conferences, and just the ways that we're able to advocate for climate are so different depending on just the political makeup of each state. Like some things that might be really, really popular in Oregon would just be non-starters if I brought them up in the Kansas legislature, which is pretty depressing, but talking to different advocates across the state helps me gather some ideas for, what's possible in terms of organizing in red states. I shared that story about organizing within the Kansas Corporation Commission with a group of advocates who organize for climate in red states, because it was a way that we were able to sort of circumvent the Kansas legislature in the interest of the climate, which actually made it very easy to advocate for ourselves when we didn't have a wall of politicians standing in our way.
Yeah, we do. We are affiliated with IPL in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, DMV.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you saw that ELCA advocacy.
Yeah, there is.
I'll include that. It's kind of blurry. It's kind of hard to read, but I got it from the ELCA so that it can share. Not every state has a KIFA, but there are different organizations in different states. So I'll include that with the links and resources too.
There are also different organizations that are just very denominationally focused. I'm Catholic, and so I know of Catholic Climate Covenant, Creation Care, Justice, things like that. Different Sisters of charity groups will also do different climate work. So different groups of women religious. So there's definitely religion specific ways to organize for climate too. The nuns at the Sisters of Charity are some of the most dedicated climate advocates that I've ever met.
Cool.
Well, Emily, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm so grateful that we have this resource now that's recorded, and we'll share this. And I think it can be very easily used in many contexts in congregations. So thanks for all your work and putting it together. It's
Thank you so much,
wonderful.
Noni. I'm really grateful that I was able to share this with your group.
Oh, we are too. We are
Thank you
too.
so much.
Thank
And
you.
best wishes for your future.
I appreciate it. The future is looking very big right now. Very
She
overwhelming.
will do great things wherever she goes. And you are such a gift to us, Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good
Good night.
night.